So good afternoon, and thank you for agreeing to participate in the Hearts of Freedom project. We appreciate your willingness to share your story with us. So I'll begin by asking you your name, please.
Arie, and if you want the second one, Gideon.
Yes?
Van Eek.
Good. Thank you and welcome. So I will begin by asking you, 40 years ago, what was going on in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos, the refugee crisis, was all over the newspapers. They talked about it on TV and the radio. Do you have a recollection of that? And if you do, what were your impressions of all the information that was being communicated?
My recollection, as an immigrant benefiting from many benefits from coming to Canada, very warm about Canada, reading all the media, especially the radio, but also the newspaper, and these horrific pictures of people bobbing on the waters off the shore in South Vietnam, brought to mind there was some horrific injustice going on over there. And while me and my folks had no prior knowledge of people from that part of the world, because we were not active in missions or trade or anything, we were moved by a compassion to think these people need help or perish. And when not long after we go into what the government of Canada's position was relative potential refugees, we heard the news from the Canadian government that, yeah, you are here, you can do that, and we will help you in specific ways that we can talk about if you like. Yeah. It was very clear to us that, one, we had no prior collection, no prior historical exchange, not even in terms of trade or so. So it was our response was based on a sense of human need.
Yes.
Period.
Right.
Yeah. Are you interested in knowing the name Don Anderson? Dr. Donald Anderson was the secretary, the general secretary of the Canadian Council of Churches, okay. CCC. Okay. My denomination, the Christian Reformed Church in Canada, fairly new in Canada, post-war immigrants, were warmly related as observers to that committee, that CCC, and Dr. Donald Anderson, the General Secretary. Don had the grace to call us to a meeting saying thus and so, we are in contact with the Canadian government who are alerting us to the fact that in 1974 or so, they had augmented their legislation about refugee sponsorship to say private sponsorships will be possible in addition to the accumulation of all these churches in Canada. And if you enter into private sponsorship, your help to those folks in need will be supplemental to, will be additional to the numbers of which Canada said, let them come. The meeting that Don sponsored to all us who were in some way connected with the CCC was very well attended, and Don had civil servants from Ottawa even then to explain to us what the legislation augmented to enhance private sponsorship really meant, untried by ourselves, because we were only observers at that point. But there were churches in Canada that had helped with the sponsorship of people being persecuted by dictator Allende in Chile, yes. South America. And Magyar Reformed folks, that's a religious title, referring to believing groups in in Eastern Europe, Hungary to be specific. There was an outflow of Hungarian refugees fleeing, and we had no national presence. The CRC, the Christian Reformed Church in Canada, mostly in America, as a matter of fact, we were a post-war emigre group coming to Canada by the hundreds and the thousands. Grateful for that reception, hearing of this need, seeing that in the newspaper, saying, what can we do? And Don Anderson said, well, let's listen. And Ottawa in those days were very good in providing knowledgeable civil servants to tell us this is how the law could be applied, if you please. If I may run ahead, I went home after the first of those meetings and said, folks, we can do something. But to make it happen, you have to enter into an arrangement with your Canadian government to apply for status as a volunteer group. As it turns out, their name is the Council of Christian Reformed Churches in Canada, applies to enter into a sponsorship agreement with the Canadian government, whereby Canada, if it approved us, would certify that we were worthy of being independent sponsors, in addition to what the government was doing. My people were organized in a national organization, the Council of CRCs in Canada, and their board quite readily agreed that this was the kind of material help that we could provide to people in need, and that the terms that the government set we were agreeable to, namely the first year that you as a local sponsorship group sponsors a family from abroad or an individual or young people, that first year you keep them from going to Canada Welfare for any form of assistance, except that they would try to get medical insurance, OHIP, yes. And that was arranged. That is to say, the first 3 months of being in Canada, folks could not apply for, well, they could apply, but they could not get OHIP. They would get an original arrangement between the provincial government, BC, Alberta, Ontario, for 90 days, coverage of their medical needs. Meanwhile, apply for OHIP in the case of Ontario. And so 90 days down the way, they were also covered with that medical insurance, which we arguably thought was one of the most difficult things to assure that people would be covered financially when they were as yet not even employed, and so on and so forth. So that was arranged. We went to Ottawa, we signed up the Council of CRCs in Canada to become a sponsorship group. As it turns out, across the country, as it turns out, the United Church was already on board with the federal government, and so were the coalition of Mennonite churches. There were at least 7 that I could identify, different communities, historical backgrounds, different linguistic, doctrinal maybe. So we were then the third one to go upon signing that agreement with the federal government. I went to Ottawa and they were too busy to say hello. They just said, sign here and bye-bye. It was a hectic time. But Ottawa was good in keeping on coming back to Deer Park Library office, where the CCC held a sub-office, and where we were getting repeated briefings about more applications for what the meaning of the law was. And it didn't take long. and we had people coming of whom we knew one thing: their family extended was broken up badly. Yeah. I remember when we drank tea with them and didn't know yet that as long as you drank, they poured you more bitter tea. It was funny. But the point is, twice that I recall, after the arrival of the early part of the nuclear family, a daughter showed up, sponsored, she came. 2 aunts showed up somewhere, Bangkok area, sign up for them too. So the extension of this kind of sponsorship work had some very intriguing applications for people fleeing for their life wherever, left loved ones behind. And like, I remember the one son, whom I didn't mention yet, son, daughter, aunts, the original son had been committed by the father in flight to a brother of the father also in flight, and said, you find Johnny, I find Johnny, we protect whoever. And that's that way that secondary arrangement was made, and many, many lives were saved in that manner. It was a precious time to be alive and to say, look, Canada government, let them come. We'll cover it for the year. Those arrangements with the feds, they were a high day in the history of these new Canadians from Western Europe, Dutch, German, French, Belgian, so on, and the newcomers from abroad.
Right.
Yeah.
At that time, what was your role and your responsibilities in your ministry?
Good question, because until that time, there wasn't the likes of me. Oh. We had 250 congregations. We were acting independently and in regional groups of 10 or 11 called a classis. The Presbyterians would call it a presbytery. And they did some ecclesial things and some help things too, but nothing broader and nothing deeper. And the churches successfully advocated with one another to appoint a first paid officer, yours truly being the successful candidate to that. So while refugees were not on my job description at all, I'm only months into the business and this whole thing changes dramatically. And who would say no to this human need? So that when I initiated the application process, having gotten that permission from the federal government to represent those congregations, it worked very well, because people remember their own successful post-war ex-Europe exodus to Canada. Dutch people were going to Australia, they were going to New Zealand, they were going to South Africa, but Canada, that was the land of milk and honey. So we believed, and truthfully so. And so where the Canadians had made such a wonderful impression, fighting for our liberty as a national country, ex-Nazis, much persecution in those 5 years. We're going to remember 75 years since next May 5, yeah, incidental. We got a lot of people responding at an emotional level, but then we had to be very active in saying, these are the things you need to do, these are the things you can do, these are the ways that we may be able to help you, or help in a consortium of more congregations in a given area. And so we even had a provision that 5 business people who were willing to sign up, banked money to a total extent that was able to foresee the needs of an incoming family from abroad, that if you could prove with your bank's endorsement that you were good as 5 families for X number of dollars, equivalent to the full support of a family from abroad, then you would be approved for a sponsorship. So that was another wrinkle, another ramification. Yeah. Yeah. Some of us, there are many local families that remember helping settlement of newcomers by way of language training, by way of transportation, by way of helping them to school, by way of helping them find housing in the first place, by way of, when they were sufficiently trained in language, also to do work on in a suitable situation, usually agrarian, you know. Most of these folks were good to do stuff with hand tools, so horticulture more than work with cattle, say. It was that kind of thing which in this part of the world, very prominent, horticulture, yeah. So a lot of our farmers too were able and willing to provide some employment for some of these folks. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I have a little wrinkle. A young man in an application for more family members to come had made himself out to be the son of a family that was here, father, mother, grandma, and a couple of kids. But this young man said he was a son. That was the one whose father and this gentleman had agreed, we'll help this kid. So he made out to be a son when, number 2, a daughter showed up back in Hancock area. Hancock? Bangkok.
Bangkok, yes.
Yeah. When she showed up, this young man left the family to the distress of all these people, meaning to do well by them, work, a place to live. And I finally had to squeeze out of him the fact that he was not a son, but a nephew or a cousin, and therefore felt ethically obligated to get out of the way for this young lady to be in that family, not brother, sister. So these kind of ramifications happened, and we've had more situations like errors in application, wrong birthday. One could not resolve that the daughter was a year younger than a son unless and until we had a DNA test done. Church paid. Complicated. But you did all kind of that kind of stuff to help people who had committed errors or whose bureaucratic applicants had not given them the right information. You did, as sponsors, all sorts of unforeseen sort of things that needed doing in order to get civil society to work in a civil and a civilian way. Yeah, I remember that blood test, that DNA thing. Frustrating. Why don't you believe us that her birthday was a half a year before? Well, why should we believe you? Well, that's a bummer. But that's the extent to which you went. Yeah. One can say a lot about the receptivity of these people to the new things that were proffered, that were offered to them. Mostly, they were very positive about housing. But we had an instance of a family offered a brand new apartment, but in a basement. These people didn't want to live in that basement. The landlord said, well, they seem ungrateful. What the landlord didn't realize is that the historical background was anything underground was dangerous. You know? So you had to make adjustments. Another fellow with pretension to some sort of royal background didn't want to pick apples in Simcoe. farmer. I esteemed him. They were good people. He says, we offered them a nearly new home. It was better than a shed, but it was, built for them. Why don't they want to work? Well, the lady worked hard, but the man didn't want to. We got a Chinese-speaking person who could confide in them and found out that this man had this pretension to some sort of royal heritage. He wasn't going to work on a farm. The Chinese person of Canadian birth was willing to take him to a nearby town and get him a job in some sort of factory. No more heard from, everything fine. But you just had to know, and that level of connectedness had to be established before the truth would come out. Yeah.
So within your ministry, how was information communicated to the different congregations about going about sponsoring refugees?
Well, basically two ways, the only two ways there were, the telephone and mail. And the generic stuff went out over my signature to every house, and not every household, to every church, for the local church to disseminate that information, again in writing or by having meetings where these things were discussed. Yeah. So we had good liaison with every local church. Yeah. And while my work of an ecclesial sort wasn't all appreciated equally, this business of reaching out to human need, tremendous. Background, we were in need when the Nazis were on our necks. Translated that. And to this day, Mr. Legault, the diaconal, that is the aid aspect of being church, is still very warm. So when you read about the destruction in Florida last week and up the seaboard, my translation inwardly is, soon my church, national, will come up and say, we will entertain volunteers going to help with cleanup, to help with rebuilding. That kind of hands-on stuff lives to this day. Yeah. Very grateful for that. Very practical-minded people. I remember when power was out in an earlier storm up in New Brunswick, voluntarily, without notice, a farmer with a good-sized truck went around to farms in this area to connect for power plants, to take them to these farms out there in New Brunswick so that they could have a power generator when the electricity was off, because the poor bussies needed milking, couldn't wait for electricity, you might say. These kind of things, they spoke to people both on the receiving end and on the giving end. Or on the receiving end, people who'd never seen a Dutch spelled name said, why you do this? And they said, well, because you have a need, and we think we can help, and we will help. And that went way back to South Vietnam, too. Yeah? And the Lao people, for that matter,
And in your ministry, how were decisions made about which congregations would take on the role of being sponsors for the refugees?
The local congregations were auto-generous. They made their own decisions, and they only needed to apply to me in my central function to say, will you please accept our sponsorship? So that not long after the first people settled, there were among those others who said, oh, my country cousin, they had families back home, and said, how can we help them? And at one point, there were 3 of us receiving applications in writing and in person once a month. And I had to say, not more than 30 a month could we process. But that application was approved on the strength of the local folks in duly functioning qua congregation and board of elders, deacons. If they said so and so, we asked no further questions. And all of these applications were done in good faith, with substance behind us. Yeah. This one church in Simcoe, I remember, I alluded to them before, they said, we don't think we can handle that kind of responsibility. A family, kids, housing, blah, blah, blah. And then these 5 businessmen stood up and said, well, the law says, if we show that we have the means, we don't need you, church. 5 of us. And those guys had a celebration when their family arrived a couple of months into the settlement process. There was great celebration because the hosts and the guests alike were wild in enthusiasm. Those were good things to happen to motivate people, to tell them there is more to your life and to your ability than, 3 square meals a day and steady employ for Papa. Yeah.
My other question is, how was all this coordinated because my understanding is that you were in partnerships with other ministries or other faith-based groups? Did you?
With respect to refugees?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, there's 2 organizations. The first one I will call the Council of Refugee Committees. The council representing delegates from CRC, United Church, Diocese of the Presbyterians and of the Anglicans and of the Roman Catholic English sector. I don't think Quebec, the French-speaking sector really got into it, but the English sector, it was wonderful to bridge some pretty big historical, I'm not like you sort of things, and to work together. We had many meetings in the Ottawa National Office, what was it called? It was an office for the churches, for the Catholic churches to meet for various ecumenical activities that were not directly related to going to Mass and that kind of thing. Help type of things, yeah. Maybe you know where the place is. It's a large office, and we'd meet in the basement, where upstairs the smaller offices of various Roman Catholic ministries had offices, but downstairs we had just off the big market, we had meetings hosted by the Catholics, which had the bigger office. We
Could I ask you, did you attend those meetings?
Many, yeah.
Could you describe what would have gone on during those meetings? What was being discussed? What was?
Well, I think 2 things: cooperation in helping with sponsorship. We've had secondary migrations and secondary sponsorships before that. Catholics in Kingston, we have pledged to cooperate to do the following. These people are coming, but my church, local in that and that place, has withdrawn its offer. Can you help? And at that time, those boundaries became very relative to the need of that group out there about to come. Yeah. So cooperation, and before that, sharing useful information that one or another had learned by one way or another. Yeah, I remember people who were very critical of my ministry for doctrinal reasons, who commended me for the refugee work, because they could understand that and overlook any difference in, I don't believe like you do, or like they do, or cooperating with other groups in terms of the ecumenical network that was developing. You know, when I got into my office, refugee work was the first thing that skewed our attention, but not long after, we started to work with Aboriginal people who come from the great blue north, hit the pavement, find discrimination against housing, work, terrible. We started and ended up having, in the course of 12 years, 3 urban settlement centers for Canadian refugees. Yeah, so that started to work. And then the inter-congregational, interdenominational stuff arguably also grew out of that more basic human need. That's where it began, the refugees. Yeah. Yeah, we had some very interesting meetings in Winnipeg, Regina, Edmonton, big time. Comparing notes, sharing experiences, cooperating in getting people into work or school. Yeah. Little anecdote. Family, I think it was in Simcoe here, sent me an invitation to a wedding, 5 or 10 years after they had come. And I said, we really haven't connected very much, have we? We saw that you were doing all right, so we moved on, you moved on. Yeah, but you've got to come. Eventually, I come to the wedding, and to make a long story shorter, all the kids were married. We were to the wedding of number 5. One had gotten a university degree and a government appointment to work in Boston, Massachusetts, for the Canadian government. It could have been Washington, one or the other. At the end of the festivities, or near the end, they said, come on up. The reason we are having you here is the very sober awareness. If you had not signed a piece of paper, we would not be here, any of us. Thank you. Okay, I'll have some more dessert. You know?
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is, life went on. Some remembered concretely, some remembered just in their nose, but I didn't hear. Not important, you know? Yeah. There were frequently efforts on the part of newly sponsored folks to give us something when they had next to nothing, and we had to resist their urge to give us a vase or a flower, whatever. Yeah.
Could I ask you, would you have had knowledge of how the congregations went about welcoming and helping the sponsors to
Quite a bit.
to integrate?
Yeah.
Could you tell me stories about how?
Well, very, very often it began with potential local, regional, seasonal people in business having the wherewithal to employ these folks, give them a job. Yeah. I'll give one very concrete example. That means that a vehicle takes about 20 people from fairly close to the middle of Hamilton by that vehicle to a local farm enterprise where people who are not skillful in mechanical stuff at the point of entry, but they had hands and they were willing to work, pull weeds, plant flowers, what have you. And these people have proven such faithful life that while good for them, there is a seasonal unemployment in the horticultural business when it's too cold to do anything on the field, when they draw unemployment. but for 9 months or 10, count on them. Never failed. Men and women, some of the young people too. So there was a mutual bond early established and a story early told. You want good workers? Ask them if they got anybody in town who's looking for a job. Pretty neat, yeah. 1 year, they had gone on minimum wages 2 or 3 years. They did some talking among one another, and they said, you know, we've been on this for a while now. Maybe the boss appreciates that we can do a bit more. We ought maybe to ask. And the boss came through and said, you're right. I don't know the details, but that it happened is true. And those people did not waltz on down the line to another employer. They stuck it. And they did some wonderful things. Communal, yeah.
Can I ask you, how would the congregations have gone about finding housing for the refugees? Finding furniture, finding clothing?
Yeah.
How did they go about assisting them?
Start with the easy part, clothing. People had more clothes than they needed, even 5 years into New Canadian life. So, Sundays, folks, we especially need warm clothing. And it came just as quickly as the Sally Ann can call on us today. The clothing. Work? Yeah, that was not so easy. Some got a job and some did not. But then there were more people in the neighborhood than people that went to the church. And I can think of specific guys right now who said, but I have a neighbor, I'll talk to him. And so by word of mouth, there were a lot of Canadian advocates for new Canadians. The housing business, that was more difficult. What can I say? New houses were being built, older houses were being vacated. You go around to the town where I lived for 40 years and see how people in Waterdown find housing, newcomers. Some build, some remodel, some finish a facility downstairs and so on down the line. That's pretty much a Canadian occupation. Yeah, and of course remuneration for housing being provided among settled Canadians was a pretty big source of income also for folks who had bought but found that the cost is pretty high. Yeah, that's part of the larger Canadian context, this housing business. Yeah, but you don't have to be terribly smart to know that to have some equity in a place builds up your means and your independence. And I remember being welcomed to one of the first houses for a refugee family. They had helped us sponsor a new coming family, and we said, well, we'll help you try to find a house, downtown Hamilton, an apartment. They said, no, it's okay. They can be in our place for at least the first year. Switched roles. Yeah. So,
did the congregations have a role to play in the refugees learning English as a second language, for example?
The short answer is not all of them, but I know a number of people who offered to do language training. Last Sunday yet I said hello to it was last Friday. I said hello to a lady at a funeral. Nothing to do with the funeral, but I said, how you doing? Well, she had been doing language training on a volunteer basis weekly after work for a select group, yeah. One aberration, couple, depressed. Language trainer said, they are depressed because they think they'll be kicked out of the country. Oh, can you talk to them? I said, yes. Can I do more? Not a clue. But we begin with a cup of coffee, Monday morning, 10 o'clock, in the meeting spaces of that and that church. And there we were, those two, their children were not with them, myself. The reason they were going to be sent back home was that they had come allegedly under false pretenses, that is, their claim to be refugees, to be in danger back home, was not deemed to be worth genuine. Well, what was the reason for the falseness? Well, he had a little garage, auto repair back home in San Salvador, and it was deemed that they owned their home and the little garage. What was not accepted back home is that somebody had routed them out of the place and said, we want that garage. And there was not enough equity and not enough justice in the world to assure them that they might retain what belonged properly to them. So they fled in fear of their life. They fled to Canada, were refused, did go back, and I said, you know what? You go back and then right away make application, and my church will sponsor you. But you still have to prove the legitimacy of this dogfight back home about who owns the garage and who owns the little home. In due time they came back. A man in Canada who was retired from the Mack Auto Factory is now doing some repair work, said, what do these people need? Well, I said, a job. We go to the donut factory. No, what do you call these round Canadian. Anyway, this factory makes these donut-like things. I was able to persuade these people, whom I knew from another congregation down the line, that they needed a job. Man and wife both got a job. The man in the auto repair business gave them a nice, older Buick or Oldsmobile. And this man, oh man, he spit shone that and took pride in it. Ooh. If it needed something, he could talk to the original owner, who was equal to the job of repair. So a new bond, friendship, helpfulness, monetary help. It was kind of, that wasn't part of your start in life. But now that you're retired, you can help people and you say, I will. Next thing you know, the wife of that auto mechanic helps babysitting for a daughter to be free to do work. Crazy circumlocutions. You know, people were exposing themselves, for the most part, with a degree of willingness to say, you need help, I can do that. Teaching them how to drive was another issue. Yeah, there was somebody there willing to do it. Yeah. So that connectedness, yeah, what can I say? One guy had a garage with 3 stalls repairing, and he hired a man. Eventually, for reasons that don't pertain to this discussion, he wanted to retire. And so an employee is out of a job, but he helps, B helps him to find another job by another mechanic. Yeah. Third one, from mechanic to pig farmer. Newcomers, by and large, were very willing to do whatever their hands found to do. Yeah.
Can I ask you, as a member of your ministry, did you have opportunities to interact with the Southeast Asian refugees yourself? Did you spend time with them? Did you interact with them?
The short answer is yes, but when you ask how much detail and over how long a period of time, then I say my effort would always be to try to involve somebody else. Yeah. Language training. In some cases, if they were willing, religious training. Always cautioning them, folks, sponsorship did not mean try to get a convert. It meant helping people in need. Appreciate that. If they come to your church for a while, we had people come, this is slightly different. People come to our church to the second service of the Sunday. We had 2 services in Waterdown, and they came for a year long with 6 or 8 of them, dutifully. Then they admitted one time that they were sometimes ending up tired at the end of Sunday. How is that? Well, they also had a service in their own lingo in a downtown facility that was not being used in the afternoon. So they could be there and have their own lingo and their own liturgy, the works. Folks, you are not obligated to us. Please celebrate your own faith in your own context. I was there recently, 6, 8 years after the fact, just to sit in, but everything in their language. They didn't even tell me what scripture passage they were reading so I could follow it. So I've been to a wedding or two, to a social event now and then, but they're on their own. They're really on their own. And whatever they do, they learned in Southeast Asia, including a songbook in their own language. I recognize the tunes because these were imports from North America. Yeah.
During that period, the Southeast Asian refugees that had been supported by your ministry, was there a tendency for those individuals to come together and form associations or to support each other?
Oh yeah.
Could you talk about
birthdays, searching for whatever needs, finding where the best places were to shop for their own favorite stuff. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Well, we encouraged that too. When I would visit the one family, there were 3 families in this high-rise, 2 of which were from another sponsorship, and I wasn't particularly involved except to say hello. But you know, you had to be there as a sponsor group, sort of sensitive to their need. I come to welcome them to their first city dwelling, an apartment, straight from wherever the feds had them in an apartment building for some orientation and facilitation of knowing where to go for to do what. And I come in and say hello, and yeah, we've met in this public place, this motel, and they said, can you help us with this stove? They had gone to the fish market, they had found plenty of stuff they thought they would like to eat, but they couldn't get their dumb stove going. They didn't know the function of a knob. So we turned it together. Whoa, that's hot. Okay, you get it. 1, 2, 3, 4. Next thing, knock on the door. Open up. 2 policemen, full garb. We are here on suspicion of some drug dealing. I said, this is the first afternoon these people live in this place. What else do you want to know? besides their name and their sponsors? No, they said, we're at the wrong place. I said, I think you are. But if I had not been there, these folks would have had to deal with a language not their own, and the suspicion from the police would have been not to let them go so easily, but to think that they would be lying.
Yes.
You know? Can you anticipate all these untoward things? No. But if you hear, here's our phone number, here's my business card, whatever. Yeah.
Are you aware of any ongoing friendships that would have been created from the relationships between the sponsors and the refugees, for example?
Oh yeah.
Could you
You know,
talk about that?
I didn't really follow those friendships in detail, but for many of them there's a secondary movement, secondary migration. Better home, better friendship, better work opportunities. It could be any number of things. Secondary migration is very common and based on subsequent information, right? Between newcomers and oldcomers, yeah. We rented a second suite for a couple that had Pa and Ma and the couple and 3 kids or so in a 1-bedroom suite. And we said, no, you need another suite. We got them a second suite, and would you believe it, Grandpa and Grandma would not go there. They needed to be with their family. Language, eating and drinking, warmth, security, sense of safety. Okay, so then they bedded down a couple of the kids so Grandpa and Grandma could be in the same place with son and daughter married. It's fine. It's your privilege, but you keep on getting a second suite because there's so many of you, and we are obligated to provide. Yeah? Yeah, so there was an awful lot of newness, right, in their life. An awful lot of newness. Oh my, how could they have foreseen? They could not. How could they accommodate people whom they barely knew, but whose language they did share? Strangers became friends pretty quickly. Yeah, very nice. Did we keep on those connections? No. Not if there was not a need. Because if they found one another in their mutual need, it was natural that they would be friends. Yeah. I remember the first summer in Canada for maybe 3 or 4 families. There was a busload of them. I said, there's a public holiday coming. I don't remember what day. I said, would you like to go out and have that free day somewhere in a park where you can picnic and play sports and stuff? Oh, so I made sure we had some rope and some balloon stuff, and great time. Soccer balls, soccer forever, yeah. So, you know, maybe from there on you hope they will be able to do it on their own or come back and ask you. They found ways, yeah. Yeah, so social life helped them to get over some pretty painful history. Many of them lost loved ones, yeah. Yeah.
I think you mentioned earlier that there were opportunities for the refugees that had arrived and were sponsored by your congregations to ask if they could sponsor their relatives who were still back in Vietnam or Cambodia and Laos.
Yeah. I was beginning to say we would have a monthly get-together with folks who came with request A, request B, and I had to come to the point where with a colleague of mine we said, we don't want to accept applications unless we can sincerely submit that application to a congregation out there. Yeah. Now, I've been retired since '99, but this week yet, I got a letter in response to my request from a group in Edmonton. In their day, they were very active in sponsorship. I told them the truth, and that is that new Canadians by the hundreds in Brampton area were well established, would like to sponsor folks, but don't have the means yet of satisfying our government that they could assume responsibility for taking a new family on. So I entered into an agreement with some of their folks. These are mostly from Pakistan, where things are rough. I have a colleague who's a minister who goes to Pakistan pretty much once a year for a couple of months to connect with a dozen small, discreet Christian congregations which worship in a quiet way, nothing loud, nothing public, but on Sundays they gather in a quiet place in a low-key manner. They have offerings, and they have the means to look for work, for housing and whatnot, to guarantee the safe coming of refugees applying to come. But the application and the guarantee for their successful coming here, housing, gathering some furniture, so easily done, yeah, both from the North American or from the newcomers. This particular confabulation of families has family, third generation, and a couple of heads of families alone. They fled, they got to Canada, they were admitted, but the process of trying to get their family here is difficult. They have to satisfy the feds that they cannot return. So this family, this minister and his extended family, they have 2 or 3 heads of family living in their basement for some years already, hoping and continuing to work whatever they can do toward getting these people here so a family will be reunited and a family will be reunited. So there's a lot of work together. The agreement of understanding, as we call it, we have between us who sponsor and they who say they will take care of the family if they come, is such that we trust them that if a family is allowed to come, these folks here will say, okay, time to collect some furniture, time to try to find a place to house them and whatnot. That there is an agreement of understanding that leads to a cooperation that gets everybody, keeps everybody off the welfare routine, because they cannot go to the feds for this. We've got a half a dozen families like that on tab. But back to the folks that would come with all these applications. I will never know how many there were that did find a way short of us sponsoring them, because the congregations that had a family online, i.e. applied for that family, would usually say, well, listen, if our family comes, we're on the hook. We're not going to take on any more. So that led to us drafting this agreement of cooperation and understanding. And the way it works, I think we got 4 or 5 families so far and a couple of individuals. But a man who's an engineer working for Stelco works with us and with that minister who goes back to the old country to support his congregations. Try together to do what we can. Meanwhile, this minister that goes back to his own people to encourage them, all his kids are working. Yeah, they're providing supportive means to help another family and another family. And it's amazing. Language studies usually are a component that we encourage. Especially the women. Don't leave them in the lurch. Of course, when they're old, they will be terribly lonely unless, you know, you've helped them to find their way into the language of Canada sufficiently. Yeah. So I wouldn't know how many of these secondary applications are still in the works, but I know they're still there. And I have a couple of successors in our national office in Burlington who help applicants with the sufficient information and application and proof of financial means. I don't think anybody in our church office, these people getting paid out of the church, is thinking of wrapping it up. No, I think they'll continue. Yeah. Because there are people out there that are suffering immensely. Yeah.
Since your retirement, have there been occasions where you've been invited to talk about what your experience was working with the Southeast Asian refugees? Are there groups that would have invited you to talk about that?
One fairly recent, Ottawa. The government of Canada invites us to come and celebrate with them that 40 years ago, these agreements of understanding between the government and the faith communities were signed. And they said, that's worth remembering. Yeah. So we had a nice day there at the Fed's expense and listened to some nice words from the minister responsible for immigration about the fact that faith communities were willing and able to sponsor thousands of people coming to Canada who needed some significant support at this critical time. Financial, urbanization, linguistic, work. Yeah. So the feds say we invented this notion of sponsorship above the number that the Minister of Immigration says we'll allow to come. Last year, about 178. That's not many people. It's all they would let us do. Those people are coming. So we advocate for a few more, and we work to the successful establishment of the arrivals when they occur. I do not really know how many people are still badgering our churches to help folks who are also in need. Rachel, our coordinator for refugee sponsorship, would know more about that than I do. But the Feds did acknowledge the worth of extended church families helping folks making application. Accuracy, statistic, no, I don't have it. Our national office on Mainway would be able to give a bit more statistical information because they are keeping book where we didn't. In the days that we started, nobody knew what sufficient documentation would be. We just did. As long as the federal government said, okay. Yeah, like Mark Malloy, good helper. Hulene Montgomery, wonderful person. Mrs. Wilson, what was her first name? Anyway, some of the folks you've talked to. Yeah.
Are you aware if your congregations supported all of the refugees, the Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians as well?
They made no distinction.
Okay.
If we said about a Laotian family, it appears they have due cause for fleeing, support them. They would.
It's likely that your congregations would have served all of the population.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Again, I don't think we documented any that said no. And no means no. The folks from Edmonton that sent me a note about the agreement of understanding said, but what if an agreement fails? And I am going to talk to him again and said, look, we have no failures on record. And what can we do to prove, that this is legit when all the evidences are there? Sincerity of intent and sincerity of preparation for such coming. Because in Edmonton, and that's why I single them out now, in Edmonton we had a pretty strong concentration of churches, about 10 congregations, and most of them were involved in one way or another, besides involvement with Canadian First Nation people. We have three First Nations groups working together to fight injustice and to help people to overcome the housing discrimination and to help them learn basic training in learning how to cope when really they were not equipped yet to do the kind of jobs that requires hammers and saws and putting in dependable time day after day after day. There's so much new to be learned, but more people today are going to university. Oh yeah, they're gaining. Yeah, I'm very proud about that, and I'm willing to believe that the success rate there is commensurate also with the ability of folks to say no to the bottle. Mm-hmm. Can't all be done in a day, but there is good stuff happening. Yeah. What are we forgetting?
I think we've done well.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this question. One of the priorities of the Hearts of Freedom project is to prepare the material that we will gather from all these interviews and share it with the new generations, the new Canadian generations, and any Canadian that would be interested to know what happened during that part of history.
Mm-hmm.
If you wanted to contribute to that effort, what would you say? What would you share in terms of information?
You know, I think some degree of documentation, of follow through, would be good. I once got a change of address notice from a group. They got their first employment in a horticultural enterprise behind my yard. I didn't follow through. I don't know where all these people are. I heard a rumor that some of them returned when some degree of civility came back to Southeast Asia. I do not know, I have not certified, but I know people in Hamilton, some of whom have returned to visit with some of their folks back home who had been living in flight from a military regime that was very cruel over the course of 13 years. Yeah, a lot of time, energy, life wasted. But the military regime there is to this day doing a lot of persecution, uprooting, unsettling, chasing him from bush to camp to bush. There's not much civil government in some of these countries. Who can predict if that civility might recur? Trying to think of this woman who in Sri Lanka won a seat in civil government, only to be told she couldn't exercise her office. There's some details that escape me now. I think it would be wonderful if some data were collected. I know from the accumulation of more paperwork that more records are being kept. I don't know about their value. I have no idea whether you could get enough documentation to speak of how many people from Laos, Cambodia, Kampuchea. No. Will you have contact with our current coordinator there in Burlington?
I'm not sure.
Rachel.
Could be a possibility.
Yeah. I didn't anticipate my own question to arm myself with a name and an address.